Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today a look at the HiFiMan Susvara, potentially the best headphone on the planet. But before I get carried away talking about that, there are a couple of things I want to cover off quickly. The first thing to let you know is that this review marks the beginning of me moving to a 1 video per week schedule. That's not to say you won't sometimes get second videos in a week on the Wednesday release, but generally expect 1 video release per week from me now on a Sunday Australian time. That means Saturday for many of you in the North American region. The new schedule is allowing me to put more time into the reviews, but also more importantly, it's allowing me to be really selective as to the products that I take on for review, and then also give me the freedom to insert urgent reviews such as the recent reviews of the Giesler Compact R2R NOS DAC and the Topping D90 SE DAC, both of which were brand new products that I wanted to share with you ASAP. So that's part 1 of my updates. Part 2 is that I've still got the giveaway of the Palmo Quiet Mini going on. If you want to be a part of that giveaway, all you need to do is be a subscriber, so hit that button now. And also leave a comment down below about something in the audiophile hobby that you would like to know more about. Maybe it's something that confuses you, maybe it's just something you've always wondered. It doesn't matter what it is, leave a comment down below, be subscribed, and you're into the draw. I'll be drawing and announcing that one soon. It's a random number generator type giveaway, so all you need to do is make a relevant comment to be in the draw. Now that gets all of the housekeeping out of the way, so let me introduce this video by saying that there is a lot of information to cover when we're talking about a headphone of the Susvara's status. This is a $6,000 headphone, and therefore I believe it deserves the attention and care that I've put into this review. That means I've got lots of information to share with you. I'm going to bust a few myths along the way, and I've also gone fairly heavy with some of the tracks I'm going to recommend. Heavy in quantity, not in type of music. So grab yourself a tea, coffee, beer, wine, whatever your drink of choice is, sit back, relax, and enjoy this review of the HiFiMan Susvara. As I said during the intro, this Susvara is a $6,000 headphone. I'm not going to convert that to Australian dollars because I don't want to make you cry. What we now already know is that it's an insanely expensive headphone. It's the top of the range headphone from HiFiMan. It's been around since 2017, but it still holds the place as one of the very, very best headphones on the planet today. The Susvara is an open back planar magnetic headphone that uses all of HiFiMan's technologies that they've developed over the years. Things like stealth magnets are in there, gold traces for the wires in the actual diaphragm, lots of different stuff, and we'll get to all of that in just a moment. Before we do though, let's talk about what you get when you've spent your $6,000 and picked up a pair of Susvaras. Within the shipping box, you're going to get yourself this beautiful display case that I've got here. So it's wrapped in some kind of leather or fake leather. It's got this metal panel here with the name of the headphone on it. There's a really cheap latch that you can't see because it's down on the table. But generally speaking, it's a nice piece of presentation for a set of headphones of this standard. As you open the box, you get a book. And I'm talking a hardcover book. So this is the manual for the Susvara, but it's actually almost a genesis story for everything that's gone into the Susvara. As you would imagine, there's not a huge amount to say about how a headphone is used from a user manual point of view because you plug it in and you play music through it. So what's in here instead is all kinds of information about the technologies used, the stealth magnet technology, the history of the development of these headphones. It's a really, really beautiful inclusion to have this kind of information shared with a headphone of this level. So that's all in there for you. There's also this soft pouch, which I don't know why you would ever want to use this pouch if you're transporting these around. It seems to me like it doesn't really offer any protection at all. I don't think it actually works to put the headphones in this and then put them back in the box, so I'm not really sure what the purpose of it is, but I do think it's nice that HiFiMan have gone to the trouble and the expense of providing a nice unboxing experience. So you've unboxed it, you've got your book, you've got your carry pouch, you've got the headphones themselves, and then you've got the cable. The same horrendous feeling cable that you get with something like the Ananda. In this case, you do get the cable with XLR termination. And if I remember rightly, I think I've left it in the box, but I think you get a 6.3mm cable as well. So it is nice that you get two cables, but they've got this same horrible feeling, almost kind of medical grade tubing type feel to the insulation around the wire. It's just a really horrible cable to interact with. Sound wise, it seems to be quite decent. I've since upgraded this cable to a really nice Borealis audio cable that has not done a huge amount for the sound, which says this one is quite a good sounding cable, but it's made a much better ergonomic experience when listening to the Susvaras. And it has improved the sound slightly, just not a huge leap. So by upgrading to the Borealis cable, and I don't want this to turn into a full review of that, but by upgrading to that, what I've got is a smoother sound, but with a greater sense of detail, resolution and space. It's a maybe 2% increase, but it's definitely worthwhile, particularly when you're getting the benefits of much better ergonomics. So having covered off the accessories, let's talk a bit now about the design of the Susvaras. These are a very light headphone for a big planar magnetic, and I say big because they're quite a large sized cup, but they're very light overall. They've got this steel headband on top here with a leather suspension band underneath, and that makes it incredibly comfortable. It's a nicely made headband. It's not at the level of something like a Meze Empyrean, which I will talk about later, but certainly I didn't feel like any corners had been cut in terms of the quality and the design of the headphone, headband, yoke mechanism, any of that. The yokes themselves here, I think probably are a cast metal alloy of some sort, and they do a nice job of allowing the ear cups to swivel. One thing I do want to flag is that you have to learn how to pick these up. What I mean by that is that a few times I've grabbed them, and in the process of moving the ear cups, it's actually very easy to pinch your finger between the yoke and the ear cup itself. I've never had a headphone do that to me before, so it is a bit of a drawback on a $6,000 headphone that things like that can still happen. But at the same time, it's not a huge deal, just something I noticed given my expectations at this level. When we get down to the cups themselves, they're this beautiful sort of satiny finished metal. You've got a view through the grille here into the gold trace on the planar magnetic diaphragm itself, and I will talk about what that's all about in a second. And then on the bottom of the cups, we've got a couple of 3.5mm connectors, so a nice normal connector there, and really nicely molded in. So rather than having it connect through this wood veneer here, it's actually going through some of this die cast or molded metal. Finally, on the inside of the cups, we've got a good sized opening for your ears. These should be comfortable for pretty much anybody. The pads themselves are quite similar to what's being used on things like the Sundaras and the Anandas, where you've got the leather on the outside and a fabric piece facing the head where it touches the skin. So they're very comfortable. They should fit and be comfortable for pretty much anybody, and therefore everything ergonomically about these, other than the pinching yokes, everything else about these is absolutely fantastic. So now let's talk a little bit about what's going on inside that we can't see. On the inside of each of these cups is a magnetic setup which uses HiFiMan stealth magnets, meaning that the magnets themselves are acoustically invisible. On a lot of planar magnetic headphones, because you've got magnets on either side, sometimes both sides of the diaphragm, those can actually interrupt the way the sound waves travel from the face of the diaphragm or the back of the diaphragm through either to your ears or into the outside world. What that can mean is reflections and turbulence in the sound waves that's going to upset your perception of the sound. Or if it's in the back wave off the back of the driver, it could cause extra reflections to come back in or just restrict the way the diaphragm can move. We're probably talking about very, very subtle variations here, but at the level of something like the Susvara, it's those subtle variations that are really going to matter. There's also been attention to detail in the way the venting is designed on the back of the cups to again minimize any disruptions or reflections from the back wave off the planar magnetic diaphragm. Finally, the diaphragm itself of the headphones is very, very thin, and it's also using a trace wire with gold plating. What all this ultimately equates to is a diaphragm which is incredibly light, incredibly thin, and has what HiFiMan believe to be the best possible materials to make ideal sound. However, you might have heard before that the Susvaras are really difficult to drive. And there is a fair bit of truth to that, but there's also a whole lot of myth surrounding the Susvaras, but also planar magnetic headphones in general. The Susvaras are a 60 ohm planar magnetic. That in itself is not a crazy impedance, it's neither high nor particularly low, but where things get difficult and interesting is they have 83 decibel sensitivity. To put that into context, other well-known headphones like, say, the Sennheiser HD650, HD800, Focal Utopia, most of these have sensitivity ratings in the 100 decibel range. So there is a massive, massive gulf in terms of how hard or easy it is to drive, the Susvara being very hard, and something like a Utopia, HD650 or HD800, which are actually pretty easy in the scheme of things. And so the Susvaras do deserve their reputation for being difficult to drive. They are certainly the most difficult to drive headphone I've ever had the pleasure to come across. But at the same time, they're not quite the difficult beasts that they've been made out to be. So let's take a little bit of a detour now, but a very relevant detour, I think, and talk about power and headphones and what it really takes to drive the Susvaras in normal situations. One of the first things that I want to cover off, because I hear it over and over again, is that planar magnetics apparently work better with more power. As far as all of my tests, both in terms of listening but also measurement, show, that's a complete fallacy. It seems to be one of these myths that started somewhere along the lines and has just propagated through all of the different headphone communities that I've ever been a part of. The reality is, once you have enough power to drive a headphone, with some headroom available, of course, you don't want to be right at the edge of what an amplifier is capable of, but once you've got enough power with some headroom, you've actually got all that you need. So when someone tells you that something like a HiFiMan Ananda or a HiFiMan Aria or Sundara is needing these huge, powerful 5-6 watt amplifiers, it's not accurate. Another thing that I see wrapped up in this is people talking about the fact that bass is more difficult to produce, and therefore when you get a more powerful amp, you suddenly hear a fuller, richer sound. Once again, not accurate. In doing my research in preparing this review, I started looking for where this all came from. And what I've come up with is that I think this myth, this misunderstanding, began in the world of speakers. If you think about your traditional floor-standing speaker, it's got a range of different drivers. To drive the bass, you've got a large woofer compared to a smaller mid-range driver and a tweeter for the treble. Because of the physical mass of the larger bass driver, in speakers, it's absolutely true that you need more power to produce bass because you're physically moving a larger surface with greater mass. In the case of headphones, almost every headphone, maybe every headphone currently on the market, is a single driver design, and therefore it takes exactly the same amount of power to move it 20 times per second, i.e. 20 Hz in bass, that it does to drive it at 4,000 times a second or your 4 kilohertz sibilance type area. So there's absolutely no difference in power requirement whether you're running a 20 Hz signal, a 100 Hz signal, a 2 kilohertz signal, or a 16 kilohertz signal. They all require the same amount of power. And so obviously when you throw music at these headphones, all the complex waveforms create this jumbled mass of interactions, but the driver is still one driver producing all of those frequencies. So it's not more difficult to drive bass in headphones, it is in speakers. And so what that means for us in headphone land is that once you have enough power to drive the headphones according to their specifications, and of course the experience, because sometimes specifications don't tell the whole story, particularly with dynamic headphones, once you have enough power, you have enough power for all frequencies. And so that brings us to the next part of the puzzle, which is understanding the amount of power that these headphones actually need. I'm going to show you a graph on screen now for some headphones that you're probably familiar with, at least in terms of their name, if not having heard them for yourself. So what you'll see as you look at this graph is that I've plotted for a number of different headphones how much power they take to get to 80 decibels, 90, 100, 110, and 120 decibels. The figures I've used here are based on calculations using the nominal specifications of each of these headphones, so they may not be 100% accurate, but they're going to be close enough to demonstrate the point that matters to us for this review. And that is that if you look at the 80, 90, and 100 decibel ranges, nothing has even gotten close to needing 1 watt. Then as we start to get to 110 decibels, you do start to see the headphones getting more demanding. And finally, by the time you get into 120, that's where things, particularly the Susvara on the top line there, get very, very difficult. So the Susvara needs 5 watts, over 5 watts, to get to 120 decibels. The reason this is really important though, is to recognize that you should never, ever be listening at 120 decibels. For some context, a nearby jackhammer will create around about 90 decibels of sound. A rock concert is getting up into the 100 decibel level or more. And so we're already at very, very loud levels. If you're trying to listen at anything above 100 decibels, you're doing permanent, irreversible damage to your hearing. And therefore most of us should, and from the comments I see on most of my videos, most of us are listening at a maximum level of 80 to 90 odd decibels. And in fact, many people are listening lower than that. So as you can see here, even with the Susvaras, if you're listening at 80 to 90 decibels, you only need a few milliwatts. So they're not the crazy difficult beast that you need a power station to drive, despite what people might tell you. Let me show you another graph now to help put that further into perspective. What you can see when you take a look at this graph is the lines running from left to right going in a diagonal downward line. Those are the rough power levels of the different amplifiers listed on the right. So we've got the Schiit Jotunheim 2, the Schiit Asgard 3, we've got the Burson Audio Soloist 3XP, and the Singer SA1. The lines may look a bit wonky there because I've plotted their different published power figures at different impedances and then allowed Microsoft Excel to join up the dots. So things aren't entirely accurate there either, but they do give us a rough sense of where the power sits. What I've then done with the vertical bar is to show you the Susvara's demand levels. The little greenish coloured line down the very bottom of the bar is what the Susvara needs in order to reach 100 decibels. And you can see just how far it is to the 60 ohm power outputs of all of those amps. If we then look at the orange section of the bar, that's to get to 110 decibels, and we've still got buckets of headroom with all of those amps, with the Soloist 3XP being the closest, but it's still got over a watt of headroom available. Finally, when we do want to get to 120 decibels, which is the purple part of the bar, then of course things are different. None of these amps can drive the Susvara to its 120 decibel peak. Having said that, as I've already covered off, you should never want to get there. So long as you've got 10 to 20 decibels headroom, there should be absolutely nothing more that you need out of an amplifier. So if you are listening at even 90 decibels, then you've still got that 110 decibel mark as headroom, and then you've still got more power on tap from all of these amps. So hopefully what that's demonstrating to you is that you can drive the Susvaras with most well-powered headphone amps anywhere up to about 90 to 100 decibels and still have plenty of headroom available. In my listening test, so subjectively, I've also found that to be true. So you might be thinking now, what about when people say they bought themselves a vintage speaker amp, or they bought a more powerful amplifier and they plugged in their planar magnetics and suddenly it sounded richer and bassier and more dynamic? My answer to that would be you're comparing two different amplifiers. So unless you can have two identical amplifiers that happen to have different power outputs, you're not comparing apples with apples. So likely what you're hearing is either a better quality amplifier making the headphone sound better, or you're just hearing a differently voiced amplifier that's making it sound like the power has caused a change to the headphone. When in fact, it's no different to going from a solid state amp to a tube amp. They're going to have different sounds. Likewise, many solid state amps have different sounds. If I go from the Asgard 3 to the Burson Soloist, both have sufficient power, as we've just seen, to drive the Susvaras to normal listening levels. But both of them have very different character. High quality amps will often have tighter, punchier control over the drivers because it's using better quality circuits. That doesn't mean that more power is improving the sound of the headphone. That means the quality of the power, the quality of the circuit is improving the quality that the headphone can produce for you. To provide a really clear example of this, let me share something that I went through when I was testing the Susvaras. I'd been running them from the single-ended output from the Hugo TT2, which on paper has enough power to drive the headphones in the same way as those other amps I've just shown you. But of course it doesn't have the power for that maximum sound pressure level. And so I'd heard people say it's better if you run the Susvara using the 3-pin XLRs off the back of the TT2, where you can get a huge amount more power. So I made up some cables for myself to adapt my headphone 4-pin XLR into the 3-pin XLRs on the back, and I fired it up. And I immediately heard a big difference in the sound. So suddenly I thought, oh my god, everybody's right, that's amazing. But then I stopped and thought about it. I just added a different length of cable to connect the last section, about say 50-60 centimeters of the cable between my normal headphone cable that I used in the front and the 3-pin XLRs on the back. To check if that made a difference, I tried the Focal Utopias. Now the Focal Utopias are very easy to drive from a power point of view. So I tried them on the front of the amp, and then I tried them on the same 3-pin XLR output using my adapter cable that I'd made up, and lo and behold, I heard exactly the same tonal change. Specifically what was happening was the cables that I'd used to make the fly lead from the 4-pin XLR to the twin 3-pins on the back of the TT2, that cable was a basic multi-core cable used for doing things like microphone cables and the like. It wasn't a particularly high quality cable, and it was lending a warmth and a thickness to the sound. I could have very easily attributed that to the fact that suddenly the Susvaras had more richness and body to their sound through the 3-pin XLRs. But that doesn't stack up when you put the Utopias into the mix. Once I got my upgrade cable from Aurealis, I also asked Jeff over at Aurealis to make me up in exactly the same cable as the headphone cable. I got him to make me a 3-pin XLR, twin 3-pin XLR to 4-pin XLR fly lead. And so now I could use exactly the same cable to the front of the TT2 and the back of the TT2. And guess what? Everything sounded identical. So again, when you hear this myth that more power makes Planar sound better, know that it's a mistake. I don't mean this to disrespect anybody that said that, and of course, as always, I'm welcome if anyone can tell me how it can make a difference. If anyone can prove to me that it makes a difference, I'm always open to change my mind and be convinced of something different here. But I've done lots of different testing, subjective testing, I've done some measurements, and I can't find any evidence that it actually makes a difference. To wrap up this section, I want to show you one last set of testing I did. What you're looking at here are 3 different frequency response measurements of the Susvaras being driven by the tiny little X-Duo MT601. Now the MT601 has nowhere near enough power to drive the Susvaras properly, and yet if you have a look here, I've got the bottom trace is the MT601 with the Susvaras at 80 decibels, the middle trace is at 90 decibels, and the top trace has the MT601 at maximum volume. If you look at all 3 traces, what you'll see is they're basically identical. There was some background noise when I was measuring these. It was a really windy day, so don't put too much emphasis into some of the squiggly bits, particularly in the lower volume measurement where the background noise is more likely to interfere. But what you can see from this is that there was no change in the frequency response, no matter the volume level. When I looked at the distortion levels that went behind this, what I could see was that distortion increased significantly as I increased the volume. And that's another key to remember here, which is that when you have a headphone amp that is running out of power, what it's going to do is clip. Clipping means that when a waveform should normally look like a really smooth sine wave, instead when the amplifier runs out of power, it's going to come up in the arc, and instead of a nice smooth rounded top, it's going to come up and go flat, and then come back down, and then come down into the negative phase and clip it at the bottom and then come back up again. What we hear when that happens is we hear distortion. We don't hear less bass necessarily, we hear harshness in the sound. And that's what I hear when I drive the Susvaras from an underpowered amp, is I hear a harsh, unenjoyable sound that actually manifests itself in the upper mids and the treble. Hopefully I haven't overlaid the point here. I want to provide lots of evidence and reasoning behind what I was saying here, just to make sure that it was clear how I got to this conclusion and why I'm debating such a firmly held belief that seems to be pervasive across the headphone community. As I said before, I mean no disrespect to anybody that said this in the past. I used to believe it. I've probably said it in the past as well. And that was a big part of me wanting to get my hands on the Susvaras, was to see just how much of it was true. Having quite happily and comfortably listened to the Susvaras running off something as basic as the Mini i3 Pro from Matrix, I can tell you that for normal listening levels, a low power amp can do the job. However, as we're going to talk about in a second, you're never going to hear the capabilities that these have unless you pair them up with high quality amplification. And I don't mean high power, you need enough power, but it's about the quality. And with that said, let's start talking sound quality from the Susvaras. The sound that these produce is flat out ridiculous. I have never heard anything like what these are capable of producing. These are one of the very few headphones I've ever come across where they're equally as good for something like mixing and producing music or voiceovers or EQing as much as they are for listening to music. They're not harsh and analytical, but at the same time, they're incredibly neutral and revealing. They're just a magnificent piece of engineering. The first thing that hit me as I listened to the Susvaras was that they've got this incredible sense of tonality and speed and timbral accuracy. When you hear things like snare hits and guitar strums through the Susvara, it's really like you're hearing them for the first time. That sounds like a cliche, but on this occasion I do believe it's true. I'll give you some specific track examples shortly to demonstrate what I mean, but these are one of those headphones that will give you an entirely new window into your music that I don't know if any other headphone on the planet, maybe something like the Abyss 1266, maybe the headphone, I haven't heard either of those two yet, but beyond those, there's really no other headphones on the market, I think, that can do what these do. Moving through the sound characteristics, the treble from these is extended, it's detailed, it's resolving, it's really well balanced with the rest of the signature. And the only knock I can have against it is that it does occasionally get just a little bit dry. Not grainy, but just dry in the sense that it's not smooth, it's not in any way kind of overly refined. Having said that, it's more about the quality of the recordings. The Susvara isn't going to hide anything from you. And what that means is that if you get anything that's even slightly subpar, you're going to hear it. It doesn't try to shred your ears with those details, but it just tells you this is not the best recording. Moving into the mid-range, things like vocals, guitars are absolutely spectacular. They've got body, they've got presence, there's a richness to them, but there's no thickness or lushness or coloration. Tonally, I find the Susvaras in the mid-range to be pretty much spot on. Everything sounds exactly how you think it should. Things like stringed instruments in orchestral pieces have exactly the right balance of textural information so you can hear the bite of the bow on the string, but they've also got that harmonic richness that comes from the resonance of the stringed instruments' bodies. As you listen to music with the Susvaras, you hear textural details through all kinds of instruments that you never knew were there. Whether it's stringed instruments, a guitar, synthesized stuff, it's all got texture and detail that was hidden by any other headphone you've tried. When we get down to the bass, the extension is absolutely perfect. The Susvara extends all the way down to 20 Hz and doesn't have any significant emphasis. There's a few minor lifts here and there, but they're a dB or a point of a dB, and therefore you don't hear any points of emphasis. That becomes really apparent when you compare them to something like a Focal Utopia, which I'll do shortly, but what it means is that you get the perfect representation and reproduction of the bass no matter how the recording was made. In a lot of headphones where there are peaks and troughs through the bass, what you'll tend to find is that sometimes that plays really well with certain recordings and other times it doesn't. With the Susvaras, they give you exactly what was in the mix without colouring it. What that means is you get bass that has weight and impact, but never emphasis. And it's really impressive to listen to. As I'll talk about a little bit later, that doesn't necessarily always make for the most enjoyable playback, but it does make for the most honest playback. Overall, the frequency response, and particularly the balance of that frequency response from bass all the way through the treble, means that the Susvaras will do no favours to the music or the playback chain. They're not going to sugarcoat anything at all, but as I said before, they're also not nasty and harsh because there's no big treble peaks. So they're going to allow music to sound less than perfect if the recording or the source is equally less than perfect. On the flip side, when you feed them with a really good recording from a really good source, you're in for an absolute experience. Finally, while we're talking about sound quality, I should mention imaging and soundstage, both of which, as you'd expect, are absolutely stellar. The soundstage from the Susvaras is excellent. It does extend a little bit beyond the head, and they're one of those headphones that sometimes in certain tracks, they'll have me taking the headphone off and looking for where the sound came from, or checking if someone's trying to call to me from somewhere else in the house. They're one of those headphones that does that where did that sound come from sort of thing. They're really impressive like that. They're not at the level of something like an HD800 or HD800S in terms of massive soundstage, but when the music calls for it, they can absolutely throw cues far and wide. Within that soundstage, imaging is really well focused and there's a great sense of layering. One of the test tracks I often use, and I've mentioned it previously, I haven't got it in my notes, is a Ryan Adams track that has a really nice sense of depth between the vocalist, the drums behind him, and then some other instruments in the soundstage. The Susvaras render that better than anything I have ever tried, including the HD800S, including the Empyreans, and including the Utopias. It just does an incredibly good job at providing the finest possible details in the sound, and that's what our ears use to put together the pieces of the puzzle to understand where everything is in sonic space. And so at this point, you're probably gathering that I am absolutely enamored with the Susvaras. To put them further into context though, let me now share with you a few specific track examples just with the Susvara on its own, and then also comparisons with the Meza Empyreans and the Focal Utopias. As I was listening to the Susvaras for this review, one of the things that I did, which is what I normally do with headphones, is I put on my favourite tracks and just hit shuffle. And then as things stand out to me, I make a few notes. The first track that caught my attention was There's Always Someone Cooler Than You by Ben Folds. The reason that caught my attention was that in that track, whenever Ben Folds sings a sibilant sound like an S, you could actually hear through the Susvaras a level of reverb either from the mixing and mastering process or from the room he was in. In other words, I don't know if it was a natural or an electronically added sense of reverb, but it only presented itself on the S sounds. I'd never heard that before, despite listening to that track hundreds and hundreds of times. So that one made my notes, but only for that little bit of reverb. A different track that caught my attention for more reasons than that one was Kid by The Living End. This track is not particularly well recorded, or perhaps it's just a generally busy sounding track with lots going on, but it was very interesting to hear the Susvara represent its different characteristics within a single track. As the track begins, there's some electric guitar and some triangles or some sort of chime being played. What was really apparent with the Susvara was how incredibly well separated that triangle or chime sound was from the crunch of the electric guitar. During that intro, you could clearly hear each specific hit of the triangle or the chime. You could hear each specific strum, so the texture of the strings as the strum was made, and then of course the sound of the resonance from the guitar as it played out. As the vocals got going, you could hear just how close the singer was to the mic. And what I mean by that, I'm not saying you can imagine the distance, but you could pick up things like all of the different mouth sounds. So when there were plosive sounds like P or B, when there were sibilant sounds like S, or when there were velar stops like K and G, each of those had its very own specific character and texture. And I've never heard anything like that before. It was really interesting and unique to hear a track like that rendered in such incredible detail. It's kind of like with the Susvara going from having looked at regular 1080p HD to suddenly getting 4K content, and you start seeing details and contrast and separation of elements that you never knew was there. Not everything though was completely rosy. When the track really gets going and the cymbal starts to get hit, what I found was that the Susvara became not so much fun to listen to. And that's not because of the Susvara doing anything bad to the music, but because, as I said before, it's not the greatest recording. Now all of a sudden, things come across busy and noisy and just not particularly fun to listen to. And that's the recording and the nature of the track, not the headphone itself. But it does go to show that when you go for a headphone like a Susvara, what you are doing is you're choosing technical superiority over, in some cases, fun and enjoyment. And I'll cover that off more shortly when we talk about the Empyreans. But first, let's talk about these guys, the Focal Utopias. The Utopias are a $4,000 headphone, so they're in kind of the same echelon as the Susvaras. I don't mean that they're same price, but they're in that absolute top end, kind of flagship, aspirational end of our hobby. To compare these two, I settled on the track Guess I'm Doing Fine by Beck. What I found as I listened to that track was that the guitar notes through the Utopia were more rounded. They were a little bit more romanticised on the Utopias. Going across to the Susvaras, things were much more textured. Both were really, really enjoyable in their own way, but it showed me the difference between these two headphones. The Susvara came across more analytical, and in this occasion I don't mean that in a negative way at all. What I mean is they revealed more about the track. Whereas the Utopias were probably the more musical presentation, and that is a term that I generally use very carefully because it's all music and it's all in the eye of the beholder, or the ear of the beholder. But in this case, I would say that the Utopias were bringing a sense of musicality. They were bringing a slight sense of, kind of, as I said before, romanticism to the sound. Not thickening it up, not making it overly lush, but there was definitely character being added by the Utopias. Something else I noticed in this track was the bass reproduction. The Utopias definitely were bringing coloration to the bass, and in certain moments they were bringing this nice sense of fullness and punch to the bass, but they also ran out of steam. Because there's a lack of extension from the Utopias that do roll off quite fast, what I found was that the bass didn't always have the weight and presence it deserved. On the other hand, the Susvaras maintained that depth and weight throughout the entire track. Through the mids and treble, the Utopia once again came across a little bit smoother, but as we got further up into the treble, things did get a bit harsher because of the little bit of peakiness that the Utopia has. Coming back down into the mid-range, and specifically now the vocals, it was really interesting hearing the difference between the two. The Utopia presented the vocals in a way that kind of really drew me into listening just to those vocals. The Susvara, on the other hand, provided better definition of the vocals. I could hear more detail and clarity in them, but it didn't focus my attention on the vocals in the same way. I'm not saying one's better or worse, it's just interesting to see the different presentations. Linked to that, I would say that the Utopia's soundstage comes across kind of rounded in shape. So the vocalist was clearly the point of emphasis right in the centre, and then everything else kind of wrapped around it, but was almost pushed back a little bit away from the vocalist. When I turned to the Susvaras, it was more of a rectangular soundstage experience where things were flatter and wider, but still had an excellent sense of layering. So it was an interesting difference in the presentations. I wouldn't want to say for a second which one I thought was more accurate or true to life, or even which one was better. They were just different presentations that were both equally interesting. Ultimately, having listened to both of these on that track, where it left my understanding of these two headphones is that the Utopia is absolutely bringing a sense of colour and character to the sound. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but they have their own characteristics, and that character is applied to every track that I listen to with the Utopias. On the other hand, the Susvara is absolutely like a blank slate, an incredibly resolving blank slate. So part of this comes down to, what are you looking for? Are you looking for a slightly more romanticised version of the music? Then in that case, the Utopia would actually be the better choice. If you're looking to hear every single detail exactly as it was recorded, then I think the Susvara is absolutely unbeatable. And so I was now ready to move on to the Empyreans, but to transition me there, I did flick through a few more tracks still with the Utopia, and I landed on Blockades by Muse. In the opening of this track, the Utopia had great energy and attack, and a bit of punch as well, but it was missing engagement. It didn't draw me into the track and have me feeling like I was a part of the rhythm of the track and the drive of the track. Putting on the Susvaras, the experience was pretty much the same. Once again, there was amazing attack and detail and clarity, but I didn't feel like I was being driven along with the energy of the music. Out of those two headphones, the Susvara was also the less enjoyable listen. There's a harshness and a dryness in that recording that with the Susvaras was just a little bit too much. To wrap up the Utopia Susvara comparison, the Susvara also lacked on this occasion the punch that the Utopias had. So whilst neither was particularly engaging, the Utopia did do a better job of having a bit of punch and a bit of impact on this track, whereas the Susvara just came across as being just a little bit too honest on this one. And so that transitioned me to the Empyreans. Listening to the Empyreans while listening to Blockade, what I heard now was a bass reproduction that gave the track energy and drive. It didn't have the punch of something like the Utopia with its mid-bass hump, but what it did do was have the presence and the weight behind the bass to drive the track forward and also offset that pretty nasty treble that comes through at the top end of Block 8s. For those of you not familiar, the Empyreans here are a $3,000 headphone, so they're half the price of the Susvara and $1,000 cheaper than the Utopia. For a long time now, they've been my daily driver. Ever since I first heard them, I've been absolutely in love. And I've kind of just alluded to why I like them so much, which is that bass presence and their ability to drive the rhythm and the engagement of the music. Don't for a second though think that I'm sitting here saying that these are a better headphone than the Susvara. They're absolutely not. The Empyreans have nowhere near the insane resolution and detail retrieval and the accuracy on the transients. None of that comes close to the Susvaras. The Susvaras make the Empyreans sound decidedly sluggish, but the Empyreans are still so much fun to listen to. They're also way ahead of other headphones in lower categories. So at this point, when I'm drawing such a strong contrast between the two, it doesn't mean that the Empyreans are a bad headphone or not worth the money. We're talking here about upper level, top of the line aspirational headphones, and the Empyreans deserve their place just as much as the Utopias and as much as the Susvaras, but they're all different headphones. One of the tracks that I chose to help me differentiate the two for this review was That's the Way by Jimmy Page and Robert Plant. The Empyreans present this track with a sense of richness and smoothness, but there's still plenty of detail to be had. I should mention that I use these with the leather pads rather than the suede or the Alcantara, so there is even more resolution to be had with those suede pads, but I do like them with the leather. So keep that in mind as I'm doing this comparison. The Empyreans gave a beautiful sense of focus to the vocals, and as I said, there was a nice sense of detail, but still a richness and a smoothness to the sound. Going over to the Susvaras, what I heard was extra detail and extra texture that made the playback really exciting and really interesting. So to this point, both of them had fantastic characteristics. At about the 150 point in this track, the band kicks in over and above just the vocals and the guitar that get things started. And at that moment, the differentiation became really apparent between these two. The Susvara, when that came in, left me a little bit cold. It sounded incredible. The detail was amazing, texture was amazing, imaging and soundstage, all perfect. But I wasn't emotionally engaged in the way that the Empyreans did for me. So for me, on a track like That's the Way, the Empyreans do a slightly better job at bringing the emotional connection to the music. The Susvaras do a better job at showing me every detail, every texture, every sound that's in the recording. Another track that happened to come on that I compared the two with, and it's along similar lines but taking it to extremes, is Can't Stand Still by AC/DC. Using that track across both of these headphones, with the Empyreans on, it's pretty much impossible not to tap your foot, not to bob your head, and not to just groove along with the music. With the Susvaras, it's a wonderful listen, but I'm more listening to the music rather than getting into the music, if that makes sense. And that's probably how I would sum up these two headphones. The Susvara is the headphone I would reach for if I want to really listen to the music, in the sense that I want to hear into it. I want to be able to close my eyes and pick out every little detail in the sound. The Empyrean is the headphone that I reach for if I want to put on the music, potentially while I'm doing other things, or potentially just to relax and get carried away with the emotion and the rhythm of the music. They're very different use cases, and in each of their own situations, I think both headphones are absolutely amazing. For me, the Utopia sits kind of somewhere in the middle. It's a headphone that I still enjoy. It's a headphone that's a little bit more romantic than the Susvara is, but it doesn't have the emotional engagement of something like the Empyrean. So it's almost like a continuum. You've got pure fun and engagement with still great quality from the Empyrean. You've got absolute insight and honesty from the Susvara. And then somewhere in the middle, maybe just a touch towards the Empyrean compared to the center point, is the Focal Utopia that does have a slightly kind of romantic and smooth sound through to its mids. It's got that slightly peaky treble, which does at times get in the way of it being completely relaxing and enjoyable, and then it rolls off in the bass, which prevents some of that engagement. But when you do hit a sweet spot, it's still a wonderful, wonderful headphone. One other point that I probably should mention is that the Susvara, paired up with a really nice tube amp like my Elekit 8200R behind me, something like that combination can also be really magical at bringing a bit more emotion into the Susvara. It often does so at the cost of some of the resolution and detail and texture, but at the same time, if you wanted one headphone that could do everything, the Susvara would be it. You'd connect it up to a revealing and transparent solid-state amp when you wanted absolute resolution and detail, and then when you wanted something that was more fun and emotional, you'd connect it up to a really nice tube amp like the 8200R. Interestingly, HiFiMan themselves recommend a tube amp for pairing with the Susvaras, so it goes to show you just how well these can perform when given that little bit of tube magic. So getting to the end of this marathon review now, I want to say first of all thanks for coming along the journey with me. I hope you found it useful, and to sum everything up, the Susvara to me is an absolutely phenomenal headphone. It is far and away the best thing I have ever heard in the headphone world. It may not have the emotional engagement that something like the Empyrean gives me, but if you said to me which is technically the better headphone, it's not even close. The Susvara is a technical marvel. The Empyrean is an emotional and artistic marvel, but it doesn't hold a candle to what the Susvara can do, and nor does the Utopia. I have to admit, when I was chatting to my contact at HiFiMan about trying to arrange a Susvara for review, I was really uncertain if I was going to enjoy them, if I was going to find them too analytical and too bright, if I was going to think they weren't worth the money. All of those doubts went through my head, and I can tell you right now that not only do I enjoy them, not only do I think they're worth the money, but they've gone over and above and exceeded all expectations that I ever could have had of them, even at the $6,000 price. And so this is a headphone that for me is one of those things that if you're a keen audiophile, if you love your music, if you like trying new gear, try and get yourself a listen to a Susvara one day. I'm not suggesting everyone should go out and buy it. It's an insanely priced headphone. But if you get yourself a chance to audition one, don't shy away from it. It's not a headphone that's going to be right for everybody. So it may be that you listen to it and go, that's amazing, but it's not for me. But I do think it's an experience worth having if you ever get the chance. So with all that said, I do want to say thank you to HiFiMan for helping me make this review possible. I hope you found the review useful and interesting, even if you're not in the market for these. And I want to remind you again that I've moved to that one review per week schedule, and so I hope to have more interesting and unique content coming soon. So hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and maybe hit the like button too if you feel to. For now though, I'll leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.